Before I get too far into this week's review, I want to thank everyone that took a chance on last week's State of the Channel video. Now, those videos can be kind of tough when it comes to the old metrics because they're hard to promote since they're not about any one particular game. But I still like doing something different from time to time, just to break things up, and hopefully you enjoyed it. And if you didn't see it, maybe give it a look when you get done with Aztec Adventure this week. I talk about the state of the collection, answered some questions from viewers like yourself, and showed off a few non-games. I've probably got another non-review coming up, maybe even next week in fact, but I didn't want to do two non-reviews back to back because I figured that YouTube's algorithm would not be very happy with me after that. Okay, now that that's out of the way, one thing that happens when you're tackling a catalog of almost 1,300 games is, and quite often in fact, is that you have a week where you're reviewing a game that you know nothing about. This primarily happens with me with Master System games, and not just the European releases that it makes sense that I wouldn't know anything about due to them not being released in the United States. There's more than a few North American releases that completely missed me as well, just due to the fact that either the game came out when I was really young, or that game magazines were doing their best to shove the console into an early grave so that they could focus on the Genesis and TurboGrafx-16 instead, when they weren't filleting Nintendo releases, that is. This week's review focuses on a game that falls into the former category there, with an original release date of September of 1987 in Japan, and then was translated for the West, releasing 6 months later in March of 1988 in the United States, and September of '88 in Europe. Why did it take another 6 months for that PAL release? Who knows? But the game we're talking about today is Aztec Adventure, or if you're referring to its original Japanese name, Nazca 88. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because you're in the small cross-section of history majors that are also Sega fans, and you know that the Nazca are not the same indigenous peoples as the Aztecs, and moreover, they're not even from the same continent. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where if you didn't think things could get more nerdy than discussing 40-year-old video games, let's throw in Central and South American history to the mix as well. That should really pump up those numbers. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. So, what happened here with Nazca 88 and Aztec Adventure? How did this go so sideways from a naming perspective, as clearly this is not just a mere translation issue from the original Japanese? Well, I don't know for sure, but when it comes to failures with the early Master System in the United States, I've got a saying: blame Tonka. It's surmised that this was simply just a marketing thing, and Tonka didn't think enough Americans would be familiar with the Nazca, and instead they wanted to go with an Aztec theme, which they thought that customers might have heard of. And knowing the US public education system, that's probably not a bad guess on their part, but could you imagine this happening in 2025? Like if the next Assassin's Creed was supposed to take place in Burma, and instead they changed it to China because they thought people were more familiar with China? I mean, social media would never stop complaining. Anyway, enough about the name. What is this game about? And is it any good? Well, I'll try to tackle all that and more, but first, a look at this specifically North American package. And here's my copy of Aztec Adventure for the Master System. I've got no clue when I picked this one up, but I'm going to assume it was probably fairly early on in the collection, as Aztec Adventure is what I would describe as a normally rare title in the US Master System catalog. And that probably sounds confusing, but what I mean by that is, for the Master System in the United States, all games are rare. They just are. There's plenty of times that you'll go into a shop and you won't see a single Master System game, or maybe they'll have one or two, but you might not even see them right away because it'll be Rampage or Bomber Raid mixed in with the Genesis games because they don't have white covers. FYI, this annoys me to no end, especially when the store does have a dedicated Master System section, But I also know that I'm probably one of very few people in the world that actually cares about such things, so I've learned to just ignore it and move on, rather than deal with an employee whose parents might not even have been born in 1986. Anyway, sorry, what I mean when I say normally rare, and I'm sure there's probably a better term for this, but Aztec Adventure falls into that sort of second tier of Master System games, one step up from the various great sports titles and hang-on combo releases that start to show up in resale stores that try to cater to the Master System community, regardless of whether they get their Rampage and Bomber Raid placement correct. Other games that I put in this category are things like Wonder Boy, Alex Kidd in Miracle World, Action Fighter, Pro Wrestling, stuff like that. Because of that, it doesn't sell for too much these days, and if you're looking for a complete copy for yourself, they only go for about $20. However, I'm more than happy to keep this particular copy in my collection. The outer cover is pristine with no scratches or gouges anywhere, and the only real blemish is the hang tab having been removed, but at least that was done neatly. The inner cover looks fantastic as well, with no water damage, edge wear, or sun bleaching, which in particular seems to have been an issue on recent reviews that I've done. The manual and cartridge have been well kept also, as you'll see in a minute. The front cover has some nice artwork with your character defending yourself while trying to escape what looks like a native in a cat mask. I like how well drawn this is, and small details are present, like the $sign on the bag of money that he's holding, and the serrated edges on the tips of the spears. If you're going to go with this type of formatting on a cover, this is clearly the way to do it. Europe got the same cover, which shouldn't be too surprising, but Japan of course got something totally different, and an expansion to the title, with it actually being called Nazca 88, The Golden Road to Paradise, with anime-inspired pictures of not just the main character, but the 3 other characters. In this case, I definitely prefer the Japanese cover, but I want to be clear that I don't think the US cover is bad. It was just trying to perhaps get kids to think of it was somehow related to, say, Indiana Jones. Flipping over the back, and there's your standard 2 screenshots at the top and flavor text below from the era. The screenshots are decent and make the game to appear nice and colorful, and the text lets you know that you're a treasure hunter named El Nino. Interesting choice for a name, but I suppose it's short. The rest of the text is pretty run-of-the-mill stuff, but then you get a stinger at the end. And remember, in a kingdom of gods, no one is smiled upon. For a colorful game aimed at kids, that line is pretty dark. Had the writer just watched Blade Runner or something? Opening up the package, and as mentioned, the manual and cartridge are in nice shape, except for a few spots on the cover. The manual is a classic Sega manual from the era with the traditional intro that sets up the story, and then also lots of hand-drawn art rather than screenshots as examples of the various items and enemies in the game for you to look out for. One thing that's particularly nice here is this section has a chart of the hidden items in each level. It doesn't tell you specifically where they are, but at least players aren't completely on their own, so for that reason alone, it's a good idea to have a complete copy. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into Aztec Adventure and see what this game is all about. I mentioned earlier the disconnect of having the game originally designed to be about the Nazca, and instead being refocused to the Aztecs. And while I think that's a good thing to mention up front, especially in light of current societal norms to be more sensitive to that sort of thing, ultimately, as far as the game goes, it really doesn't matter, which then leads back to the original question of why even change the name in the first place. The important part of the name is the subtitle, The Golden Road to Paradise, which of course got removed from Western releases as well, although it's still present on the title screen. And definitely not the confusing 88 part, because it's not like this was a Madden game and they needed to differentiate this game from, say, the 86 or 87 editions of Nazca. Moving on, the reason why the Golden Road to Paradise is important is because it sums up the plot of the game. If you read the manual or rear cover, you'll find out that the main character depicted on the front cover of the game is El Nino, and if you're not up on your Spanish, El Nino means the child. Now, I'm not exactly sure why Sega thought it was a good idea to name your character the child, but maybe they were going for more of a badass interpretation. And instead of the child, what they were really going for was the kid, as say in Billy the Kid. But I think that's probably stretching things a bit, as more than likely this is probably just a weird translation thing coming from Japan. However, the naming weirdness doesn't stop there. El Nino isn't the only person that's on the golden road to paradise. As he navigates the various levels and terrain, he'll also run into what we call in 2025 frenemies. Or, I guess some people do. I definitely have never said that word out loud before this review. What I mean by this, though, is that when walking through the levels, you'll run into 3 animal-based characters that are shown on the Japanese cover of the game. There's Papi, the bird, Pupe, the cat, and Poh, the dog. Why they didn't swap the names for the cat and dog so that the dog is named Pupe, I'll never know. But all of the names are a bit weird, so I suppose it's a good thing that your character is just called El Nino and not El Pepino or La Papa. Papi, Pupe, and Poh are best described as mercenaries. And no, I'm not saying that just so I don't have to say frenemies again. Damn it. As you go through the levels, you'll pick up special items after defeating enemies, and one of those items are bags of gold. But unlike most action games where gold equates points for your score, the bags of gold are actually useful items in Aztec Adventure. And you can throw them at Papi, Pupe, and Poh to bribe them to fight with you rather than against you, and help you on your journey through the level, with each character having different bag requirements to get them to help you, i.e. Papi only needs 1 bag to switch sides, but if you want help from Poh, you'll need to make sure you have 4 bags available instead. And it appears that the different amounts of money aren't just to give some variety to the game, as Papi, Pupe, and Poh all seem to take different amounts of damage, with Papi being the weakest and Poh being the strongest. So it does benefit you to being able to afford Pupe or Poh if you saved up enough bags. And there's also some strategy involved in that you can only have 2 mercenaries accompanying you at one time. Well, benefit might be a bit strong of a term there. Having help from the computer in a single-player action game is an interesting concept, but at least as far as it's implemented in Aztec Adventure, I've got to be honest, it kind of sucks. The problem is the AI for Papi, Pupe, and Poh is incredibly dumb. They don't specifically set out to attack enemies on screen, but they will, somewhat half-heartedly, mimic whatever attack you're doing, whether it's with your sword or with a special item, even if it doesn't make sense for them to do so due to them not being lined up to attack the same enemy that you are. They'll also frequently get stuck on random parts of the level, so if you're not paying attention while moving forward, they'll get left behind and disappear. The best use I could find for them was to potentially get in the way of enemies and take projectile damage that otherwise might hit you, but even that can be a bit problematic because they'll probably end up getting in your way as well, and you'll end up taking a hit that you might not normally due to trying to walk around their path. To be totally fair to the developers of the game at Sega R&D 2, this is a game that came out originally in mid-1987 on a single megabit cartridge, so you kind of have to temper your expectations a bit about what was actually possible. And honestly, I do like the concept of having tweener enemies that you can make fight for you. It's really not something that you see too often in video games at all, certainly not in action titles. The only examples I can even think of at the moment are perhaps from turn-based RPGs where you can cast mind control or a confusion spell. Ultimately, I usually would end up either avoiding them because they won't attack you right away, or attacking them as they will drop items you might need, but that's a bit risky as you really don't want to take any damage in the game at all that you don't have to. Let's move on and discuss how the game is actually structured, because that subject of taking damage is going to come up again. Aztec Adventure is made up of 11 levels that are presented in a top-down fashion, similar to an older arcade machine, or the game that they are most likely trying to emulate, The Legend of Zelda. The first 10 levels consist of 2 of each of the following areas: forest, underground waterway, desert, marshes, and ruins. And if you make it through all of those, you'll get to the final level in the Phantom Shadows, where you'll have to fight an assortment of bosses from the previous levels. I like the fact that there's effectively 6 different types of levels here, as it keeps things interesting with the different enemies based on level type, and of course different background graphics for each. Each level is effectively a simple maze where the goal is to go through the exit at the end to the next level, but the door at the exit will only open once you've defeated all the bosses in the level. For the most part, due to needing to defeat all the bosses before the exit opens, the levels are somewhat linear, but you can still go back and forth between the various areas of the level as you like, in case you need to stock up on weapons. But be warned, the wishing wells to refill your health can only be used once per life, so it doesn't help to backtrack to one to use it again. I found that out the hard way. Even though the level layouts are relatively simple, I still like how they're designed, and there are times when you'll see sections of the level that you haven't gotten to yet, or there will be a branch off the path that leads to a room that might be helpful to go into, rather than just run to the end. As you make your way through the levels, then either avoid or attack enemies, you'll need to keep an eye on your health. El Nino can take a fair amount of damage, but with all the hazards in the levels, what seems like a small amount of damage taken at first can add up quickly. Thankfully, in most levels, there will be a wishing well where you can get your health refilled, but you have to get to it first, and it may be after a boss rather than before. If you do happen to run out of health, you'll lose a life, but, and this is something that I think the designers really need to be credited for, the levels have checkpoints after you defeat a boss. So, say if you manage to get past the first boss of a level, but not the second, you only have to go back to that first boss room, rather than restart all the way back at the beginning. Games having checkpoints in the middle levels was not a common occurrence in the 80s, so having them present in Aztec Adventure is a pleasant surprise. Unfortunately, the checkpoints are necessary for the average player to even have a chance of finishing the game, as it features no continues. You can earn up to 4 extra lives by defeating the 4 Ranabake bosses that appear as you go, meaning you'll have a total of 7 lives to complete the game, but that's assuming you can even make it to those bosses to try to defeat them to get those extra lives. This is when I kinda checked out of the game. While I understood the developers not wanting to make the game too easy on players, so they wouldn't finish it too quickly, having to finish the game with just the default amount of lives is a bit tough. Maybe if the mercenary system worked better, I wouldn't mind it so much, but as is, after dying on the 4th level for the 5th time in a row, I really questioned my desire to play the game enough to where I could go through all the same type of areas I just went through a second time, only to deal with a boss rush at the end. I already mentioned the failings of the mercenary system, but another element of the game that doesn't work quite as well as it probably should is the controls. And to be clear, I don't specifically think the game controls are bad, button and D-pad presses are responsive, and the game does do what you tell it to. However, they are a bit awkward. Nino's sword attack is directly in front of him in a thin line. This is due to Nino swinging his sword vertically up and down rather than right to left. What this means is that Nino has to be precise when attacking enemies. It's not enough that they're near him. Nino has to be lined up just right to hit them. And to add insult to injury, most enemies take multiple hits to kill, not to mention the bosses. What should aid Nino in his efforts are special weapons that he can pick up as he moves through the levels, but even those are only questionably useful, and the implementation for the special attacks is again slightly awkward. Essentially, your special weapons are shown via a horizontal line at the top of the screen, and you have to tap on the 1 button to iterate through them from left to right. This means you'll have to temporarily stop using your sword while in the middle of combat, hit the 1 button as many times as it takes to land on the item you want to use, and then attack. And Lord help you if you hit the 1 button one too many times and pass the item you want, which of course causes you to have to start over while most likely being attacked. I get that they were limited in what they could do with a 2-button controller, so I don't want to complain about this too much, but it definitely takes some getting used to. I think my bigger problem is that most of the special weapons they just aren't that special. Beyond the bags of money, you get access to what appears to be a cannonball, an arrow, a cannonball that goes in 4 directions, and a rotating item that changes based on what type of level you're on. The problem is, not all weapons can be used on all enemies, so rather than try to toggle to the special weapon you want to use for the enemy that's on the screen, assuming you can even remember which weapon can be used on them, it's usually just easiest to use your sword or avoid the enemies entirely. The level-specific items tend to actually be the most useful. It's just unfortunate that the rest of them are usually more trouble than they're worth. From a graphics perspective, I like Aztec Adventure, especially considering what I said earlier about the game only being 1 megabit in size. It's not overly complicated to be sure, but it is colorful, and the enemies and backgrounds have some nice detail to them, and everything has a unique look to it. There's no palette swapping going on here. To go along with that, there's a decent amount of enemy types sprinkled throughout the levels, so you're not just fighting the same 3 enemies over and over again. There can be a little flicker or slowdown here and there, but this usually only shows up if there's either a lot going on that particular screen, or if you have 2 mercenaries with you. But this is really only a problem in very specific places, and it's not nearly as bad as what can be seen on other Master System titles. Sound-wise, Aztec Adventure is one of the Master System titles that has dual soundtracks, with both the default PSG and FM sound available if you have the hardware to support it. Most of the time so far on the channel, when I've reviewed a Master System title like this that has support for both, the FM sound is usually better for background music, but the PSG is better for sound effects. So I usually end up saying that it really comes down to user preference as to which should be used. However, in the case of Aztec Adventure, I strongly recommend playing the game with the FM version if you can. There's 2 reasons for this. One, the game really doesn't have that many sound effects to begin with, so even if you think the PSG versions of the effects are better, the difference in switching between the 2 is pretty minor. The other reason is that the FM version of the music in Aztec Adventure isn't just marginally improved from the PSG version, it is much better. To the point where I would say Aztec Adventure would be one of the games Sega would want to use to show off why someone would want to have the FM sound module. The music is still relatively simple in composition due to the limited space available on the cartridge, but the better quality of the sound makes the game much more enjoyable. I specifically picked out Aztec Adventure to review this week because I was looking for an older Master System game that was on the simpler side when it came to gameplay. And that's exactly what I got. So in that regard, Aztec Adventure is a success. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good game, and it became pretty evident when playing the game this week that there were some great ideas here, but they just weren't executed very well. I really would have liked to have seen certain things tweaked a bit, like perhaps the mercenaries being a bit more useful, or your sword attacks not needing to be quite so precise, and then maybe adding at least 1 continue. As a result, I'm giving Aztec Adventure 2 stars. If you enjoy Zelda-styled top-down action games, I'd recommend giving it a shot to see if you like it, but everyone else should probably stick with the better examples from the genre. And that's it for Aztec Adventure on the Master System. To my point previously, yes, this was an earlier Master System game, but it's not like it was a launch title, and coming out in the United States in March of 1988 puts it over 6 months after The Legend of Zelda. Now, is it completely fair to compare those 2 titles? Probably not, but that's what kids and gaming magazines would have done at the time, and Sega clearly can't say that they didn't know what the competition was going to be like. I think my real issue with the game is that after I'd played it for a few hours, apathy kind of set in, because I knew that I was just going to be doing a loop through the same types of levels again, and without any kind of story or other elements to push me forward, there really wasn't much of an incentive to see anything new, other maybe than the last level, which the manual had already told me was just a boss rush anyway, and I dislike those in any game, even stuff like Streets of Rage. I will say that this might be the game to finally get me to buy something that allows me to play games in FM mode for the reviews though. That soundtrack was a very pleasant surprise. Next time on the channel, I think you'll be seeing a review, but I've also got a pickups video from the last trip cooking, so that will be appearing at some point as well. At the convention and at various shops in the area, I was able to add 11 games to the library and upgrade another to the best quality version of a certain title that I've ever seen, to the point that it was almost an instant buy when I saw it. But I don't know if the algorithm can take another non-review so soon, so I'll have to figure out when that's going to appear. In the meantime, I think it's time for a review of a Mega Drive title that was originally supposed to be released in the United States to the point of even appearing on posters, but then was canceled for mysterious circumstances. I don't know for sure, but I can only assume that we didn't see it due to a bit of a copyright war breaking out. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 288. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!